Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it's a great honor to be here. It's my first opportunity to come to one of these meetings, and I've been thoroughly enjoying it so far, and I'm sure that will continue. So we are taking a long-term look here. I'll mostly focus on out to 2050 because of the brief time I have. Just brief acknowledgments of funding, and I did want to stress that this is a co-authored paper with a number of people on my team at IFPRI. Just in terms of the outline, we're going to talk just a little bit, looking back at last couple decades of how Africa has been on the rise, and then looking forward to the future. I'll present very briefly the methodology that we utilize, the IFPRI's impact model, to look at long-term perspectives on the agricultural sector, including the effects of climate change. And in giving the outlook, we'll look at a wide range of outcomes, projected outcomes for food security, supply, demand, trade, and prices. Then I'll come forward with a few conclusions. So as we heard also yesterday from Usman, despite the worldwide crisis in the 2008 and crises in the late 1990s, Africa has done a strong job in terms of growth and poverty reduction over the last couple of decades. Although it has been somewhat isolated from global economy in terms of smooth functioning in international markets, the growth has shown a significant resilience in African economies, if they haven't quite kept pace with, for example, South and Southeast Asia. But as we saw already, per capita GDP grew at 2% per year in the decade leading up to 2012, even though there was high population growth. The current average incomes across Africa are already approaching the middle income classification. Of course, they vary tremendously across countries, with Eastern and Central Africa lagging behind in terms of having a number of low-income countries, and northern and southern regions mostly represented by stronger middle-income economies, and Western Africa also has been growing actually at 4% per capita GDP growth. In terms of the big indicators under the MGDG goals, undernourished children, there has been improvement across the entire region, though persistent issues arise. And this is generally true worldwide, that making progress on childhood malnourishment is a really tough indicator to deal with, because it not only has to do with agriculture, but with health, nutrition, and a number of other policies. But even then, as you can see in the two lower lines, that Northern and Southern Africa have achieved that MDG of between 1992 and 2012 of cutting in half the prevalence of undernourished children. The other regions are showing progress, but of course not as fast as we might want to see. In terms of the total undernourished population, or the number of hungry in the population, here there is more broad-based and strong progress, as you can see, with much steeper declines over the past 20 years, with improvements by almost a half a percentage point per year in most of the regions. And as you can see, several of the regions did make that goal, others of having the prevalence, others have strong performance, but not quite meeting the goal. In terms of agriculture, the growth in African economies really has been rooted significantly in strong expansion of the agriculture sector, with moving past the poor performance prior to this period. Value-added growth for agriculture for all of Africa was more than 5% per year over the past 10 years. Of course, again, tremendous variability, with some countries, particularly conflict countries, having negative performance, but others with very rapid annual growth. So the agriculture over time, of course, as structural transformation proceeds, will have a decrease in share of the economy. It remains a cornerstone for advances in development in the future. What we're going to be talking about most of the rest of the time here is looking forward, the projections going forward. And here we're using it as the baseline projections of population and income growth. We're using what's called the SSP2 scenario, that's shared socioeconomic pathways, which is the sort of agreed upon set of economic and GDP and population growth rates that go along with different climate change pathways. these are fairly optimistic. So what I'm going to show you is a relatively optimistic baseline, but one that would be hugely important to achieve. Overall, as you can see from the comparison with East Asia and Pacific, going forward, you're seeing almost proportionally the same level of growth in Africa, in most of Africa, as you're going to see in East Asia and the Pacific in the future. So there'd be much more comparable growth in the future under this scenario, and with 3.6% annual growth in per capita GDP over that period. So very substantial increases even over the last decade. Under this kind of assumptions, this shows maps of projected changes to World Development Report indicators under income status, where you can see a very rapid advancement from low income or low middle in most of the continent in 2010 to a very rapid improvement in terms of movement towards high, middle, and then high income growth by 2050, high income status by 2050. So those kinds of population GDP growth will move forward a lot in terms of the prospects for Africa. Now let's turn to the agricultural sector. And here again, we do use the impact model, and let me just run through quickly some of the key points. If you look in the sort of middle right section there, the core of the model is the impact model, which is a partial equilibrium economic model of the agricultural sector. It generates annual projections on the wide range of things: crop area, livestock production, prices, trade, and also food security indicators. But in order to do that, in that model is a basic economic model. For example, crop and livestock yields are a function of prices, input prices, investment levels, relative water supply, climate change, and technological change. And those indicators in turn, drivers in turn, are generated through other aspects of the model. In the upper middle, you see the climate forcing. So we do use a number of the general circulation models that generate climate change forecasts, and then feed those through the impact global hydrological model and water simulation model, which then determine again on an annual basis the availability of water for agriculture as well as for all other sectors. Those factors in turn determine the water stress under different climate change scenarios that feeds into those supply functions. We also have the DSAT biophysical crop models, as you can see in the upper right. Those also contribute to looking at the biophysical yield effects of climate change and water stress. And then we have the underlying population and GDP growth, such as the GDP growth I just showed you, and also underlying technological change for yield growth, which is the function of investment in a number of factors. It's a highly disaggregated model for a world model, 159 countries or regions. Then it's subdivided in 154 basins, so we have like 320 distinct food production units. As you can see, Africa has quite significant disaggregation for this region. So let's turn quickly to some of the results. First of all, here are the projections of global prices for cereals and meats as groups. You can see here alternative scenarios. We have this indexed to the real prices in 2010. And you see the band, you see the red line and the band around the red line. The red line is the average projected price increase under a range of climate change models, the general circulation models, and then the red line, and then the band around it is across those models. And then the line below is a projection of what happens if there's no climate change. So first of all, you can see under any scenario, even without climate change, we're expecting stronger global prices in the future. And under climate change, that gives another significant increase, as much as 25% increases relative to a no climate change scenario in 2050, somewhat larger increases for cereals than for meats. We also see the same kinds of effects for fruits and vegetables, and shown here for roots and tubers and pulses, with anywhere around 10% increases due to climate change in 2050, and about 30% above 2010 levels. So, and the importance, of course, of price changes depends on integration of world markets, opportunities for exporters, and it becomes a significant challenge for net consumers. Production, here we show for 5 regions in Africa, and we show the 2010 value is the first bar. Then we have the no climate change 2050, and then we have the average of the baseline climate change scenarios to 2050. So you can see that we do show strong growth in cereals, about 2% per annum to 2030, then declining somewhat from there. We're getting about 2/3 of that is from crop yield growth, and still about 1/3 though from area expansions, which is, so that's an area where if productivity growth could be boosted, we'd do better. Climate change, as you see, it reduces production by about 6 to 12% by 2050 for Africa and most of the regions. As well. You can see also very rapid growth in meat production projected across the regions. Also here, we just look quickly at roots and tubers and pulses. You see West Africa, of course, dominates the production of both pulses and roots and tubers. Africa produces about 20 or 30% of total global pulses and roots and tubers, so these sometimes are forgotten, but these are extremely important crops, and we have most of them are consumed domestically, but as we'll see also, there is significant trade in those in the future. Let's look at the total demand side. I think this is what's really impressive and shows the overall challenge, but also a very good outcome in a sense because we get very rapid demand growth. Part of that, of course, is due to still high population growth. And again, this SSP2 scenario has a relatively optimistic population growth rate of about 1.9% a year. Other sources show as much as 2.2 to 2.4% a year. So this is, again, reasonably optimistic. But again, you see demand for cereals, oil seeds, roots and tubers will more than double by 2050. Pulses and fruits and vegetables will triple. And meat demand, the blue line there at the top you see is, we feel is going to increase 4-fold over this period. So huge increase in meat consumption. Again, partly due to that population growth, but very much due to the rapid per capita income growth and the relatively high elasticity's propensity to consume meat out of additional income here in Africa. Per capita demand, also you can see the story here. For cereals, you see in the north where there are very high levels already, we see a decline, and you see that in much of the world, and like in most of Asia, for example. And several of the other regions, you see still some solid growth in cereals. But meats, where the really rapid growth is going to be on a per capita basis as well as in total demand, as you can see here. Roots and tubers has a couple changes depending on the region, declining consumption on the per capita basis where demands are already traditionally high, and there's more diversification of diets, but increasing where it does represent additional dietary diversification. Pulses, we find are strongly increasing across the continent. Net trade, and here's a slight wake-up call, is that because of those rapid demand and despite the fairly strong production that we're projecting, you do see very large increases in demands for almost every region for cereals and meats. Again, it may not be that bad of an outcome because with those rapid increases in income, you're going to be able to pay for these most likely. But it is something to take a look at. Another issue of why you might want there should be additional productivity growth here. Roots and tubers and even pulses, you have a similar situation of increasing imports over time. But again, it's important to note that some of this is really interregional trade as well. So it may be trade, for example, from Western to Central or Western to Eastern Africa. So there is interregional trade embedded within these total net imports over time. Food security, and here's where you're seeing very strong growth in per capita calorie availability both under no climate change and with some negative impact of climate change, but still strong growth compared to 2010 across the region. And you get extremely good performance in terms of reducing the share at risk of hunger. So over the next 35 years, you're going to get there's going to be a much, projected to be a much greater progress on reducing hunger in Africa, given the projections of income, population, and agriculture sector performance. Let's then look at some quick conclusions. First of all, if we can generate this kind of strong GDP and agriculture growth in the baseline, large improvements in food security will be achieved. But of course, these aren't just going to happen by business as usual. So this, as I said, is a pretty strong performance projection. And some of the key policies to include this include increased investment in agriculture research and enhanced on-farm management, together with much higher investment in rural infrastructure, which we'll hear more about from Maximo this afternoon. Emphasis in ag research should be on crop and livestock breeding and likely requiring biotechnology. And there's a need to target the abiotic and biotic stresses generated by climate change as well, feeding back to some comments that Kwesi made yesterday. There's a lot of potential for improvement at the farm level too. It's not just about getting new varieties out in the field. And we've done work recently at IFPRI showing strong potential from a number of technologies, including relatively low-tech precision agriculture, use of minimum tillage, integrated soil fertility management, and integrated pest management, and to some extent from reduction of post-harvest losses. Rural infrastructure, again, is going to be essential to improve access to markets, information, credits, and inputs, to get farmers higher prices for their outputs and let them pay less for their inputs. And complementary investments in healthcare, education, and social safety nets would also be needed to achieve the kind of performance we showed. So with strong GDP growth, the agricultural sector will decline, but remains critically important for employment and income growth, which is where much of poverty still exists. So I think one of the key items, these are sort of very general prescriptions I'm pointing out here, the key items are the CADP processes, the joint JSRs, and other things that we're talking about here at these meetings, is going to be how do you take that broad message and actually develop investment plans on a country basis so that you can move forward to achieve the kinds of successes that we hope we can see based on these results. Thank you.